All right, good evening and welcome. My name is Dana Treichler. It is my pleasure to host tonight's program. This program is presented in partnership with Princeton University Press with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Tonight we'll hear from Torie Bosch in conversation with Claire L. Evans and Lisi Rankin about their new book, You're Not Expected to Understand This, 26 Lines of Code That Changed the World. Following a conversation between the speakers, we'll reserve about 15 minutes for audience Q&A, and the program will last about an hour in total. So to start with some bios, Torie Bosch is the editor of Future Tense, a collaborative project of Slate Magazine, New America, and Arizona State University that explores the implications of new technologies for our current and future world. She's the editor of You're Not Expected to Understand This, How 26 Lines of Code Changed the World, and co-editor of Future Tense Fiction and What Future, the year's best ideas to reclaim, reanimate, and reinvent our future. She is also an editor in residence and lecturer at Arizona State University's Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communications, and recently launched a new Slate ASU project called State of Mind, devoted to covering mental health. Claire L. Evans is a writer and musician exploring technology, ecology, and culture. She is a singer and co-author of the Grammy-nominated pop group Yacht and author of Broadband, The Untold Story of the Woman Who Made the Internet by Penguin Random House, and the co-editor of the speculative fiction anthology Terraform, Watch Worlds Burn. She is the former Futures editor of Motherboard and a contributor to Vice, The Guardian, Wired, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Eye on Design, and The Verge. She lives in Los Angeles, where she's an advisor to graduate design students at Art Center College of Design. Lastly, we have Lisi Rankin, who stitches together STEM and the humanities. She is a professor in the Department of Technology, Culture, and Society at New York University's Tandon School of Engineering and a senior research scientist at the Center for Responsible AI. Prior to becoming a professor, Rankin taught herself to code and to knit, double majoring in math and history, and worked at the intersection of tech startups and education for over a decade. Her writing emphasizes public scholarship with bylines ranging from Slate and Spike Art Magazine to Science News and Smithsonian's What It Means to Be an American series. Rankin's first book, A People's History of Computing in the United States, was inspired by her work with K through 12 students. Her multimedia work includes advising film and TV, as well as playwriting and public speaking, and her website is www.joyrankin.com. So before we continue, just a few housekeeping items. We recommend using the Zoom app for the event rather than operating from your browser, as sometimes it just works a little bit better. This event is being recorded, and recordings are typically added to the library's YouTube channel in the days following the event. Live transcript is enabled for the program. You can turn it on and off via a button at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you have any comments during the program, please enter them in the chat box. If you have any questions for me, if you have questions for the speakers, please enter it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you're using a mobile device, the Q&A function may be at the top right corner of your screen. Lastly, copies of the book are available through Princeton's own Labyrinth Books. I'll drop a link to their website where you can purchase a copy in the chat in a few moments. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to turn things over to Torie Bosch. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dana. Thank you to everyone who joined us tonight, and thank you especially to Joy and Claire for being here and for contributing their great thoughts to this book. The book grew out of a 2019 Slate project on the history of programming, and the idea originally was to look really narrowly at particular lines of code that had been influential in some way. And to get started on that, we surveyed a whole bunch of experts, so technologists, journalists, historians, asking them to nominate code snippets to include. And what these experts told us very clearly, very quickly, was this was not a very useful way to think about programming and to think about what programming means. And instead, everyone told us we should be looking a lot more broadly. And so in the series that appeared on Slate and now in this book form, which is a greatly expanded version, we took their advice and have defined code pretty broadly. So we're looking at software, programming languages, as you'll hear about from both Claire and Joy, and some individual snippets, but really put into the broader context of the code, and most importantly, the people who wrote it. So often when we think about code, We think of something that's really kind of clinical and static, and it's either right or it's wrong. And the decisions that are made are just the ones that had to be made. But it's not. Code is messy and brilliant and kludgy, and it is made by humans who have biases and blind spots, and can be brilliant and can be sloppy, and sometimes all within the same program. So the idea here, and the sort of tongue-in-cheek title gets to it, is to sort of talk about how we understand code and the stories behind it. There are chapters in the book that talk about the code that guides the Roomba. If you have a Roomba, I can't have one because there's too many stairs in my house, but it sounds fascinating and wonderful. We have code talking about space exploration and technology. There's one example in which the code works brilliantly, and one example in which the code ruins everything, and they're a really wonderful pairing. We talk about the VW mission scandal, the first police beat algorithm, which really gets to some of the very modern questions about algorithmic bias and the criminal justice system. We talk about the first computer virus. And what we really do, of course, is talk about the people behind all of these stories. And you can't talk about the people behind the code without talking about identity. So one of the themes that really runs through the book is the way that women were at first absolutely central to computer programming, computer history, and then really quite suddenly, as we'll talk about, got pushed aside as it was coming into maturity. So today we're going to talk to the authors of two of my absolutely favorite chapters of the book, which is why I could not be more excited about this. They're authors who I admire really deeply. Their books were critical in helping me think through this project and so many other projects. So I highly recommend, if you're interested in the history of programming, especially women in programming, please be sure to read Claire's Broadband and Joy's A People's History of Computing in the United States. What I'm going to ask now is for Claire and Joy to each read the first paragraph or so of their chapter and tell us a little bit about what they say, and then we're just going to have a conversation. And at about 45 minutes past the hour, we'll open it up to questions. So please start filling up that Q&A as we go. Claire, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this book and in this webinar. It's an honor to be in your company, both of you. My chapter is called Jean Samet and the Code That Runs the World. I'll read the first paragraph and then I'll kind of explain it. So here we go. Jean Samet wore horn-rimmed glasses, stood ramrod straight, and looked the world dead in the eye. Born in 1928, Jean was a math whiz. The Bronx High School of Science didn't take girls, but she excelled at her public high school and eventually at the University of Illinois, where she earned a master's degree in mathematics in 1949. But when she graduated and scanned the classified ads for a job, she was quickly disheartened. In the 50s, job listings were still separated by gender. On the women's side were openings for clerks, teachers, and housekeepers. Jean flipped the page and scanned the job listings for men. So this chapter tells the story of the computer scientist Jean Samet and her role in the development of the Common Business-Oriented Language, or COBOL, which was and is one of the most influential chunks of code probably ever written. COBOL was created in the late 50s, in 1959, as an attempt to create an industry-wide standard during a time of exponential growth and change in the computing industry. This is an industry that had begun essentially as a product of the war effort. You know, the earliest electronic computers were created during the Second World War to run ballistics calculations, which up until then had been done by hand by, of course, mostly women. And so by the 50s, computing had kind of gone commercial and was exploding. And many of these women that had been onboarded into the world of programming, who had invented programming during the war, had stayed on in senior positions throughout the industry. And in the 50s, it was still very much considered to be women's work. It was really common to find women in senior positions in programming departments, both in government and in the private sector. Jean Samet is one of these women. By the time she was working on COBOL, she had already worked in senior roles at all the big famous computer companies of the day, none of which exist anymore, but companies with names like Sperry Gyroscope and Remington Rand and Sylvania Electric Products. But she, like a lot of programmers of her generation, was really struggling because in those days, software was not an off-the-shelf product. It was not a word, actually. And so every time a new client wanted a piece of software or wanted to buy a computer, you know, a team of programmers would have to create a custom installation, a custom piece of software for whatever, for aviation industry, for insurance, for the government. And they had to debug and run and often do sales and do customer support. It was just an enormous amount of work because no one really took it seriously or considered to be as important as, of course, the very masculine craft of creating the hardware itself. So it's kind of the demanding nature. I'm not the first person to say this. There's been lots of scholarship on this subject, but it's the demanding nature of this work that really forced the development of programming as an art. These women were looking for ways to simplify and streamline their work. They were looking for software intermediaries like compilers and generators to make it easier, ways to document code to make it easier to reproduce their work. And of course, eventually the invention of interoperable software languages like COBOL. So the committee of people who put together COBOL involved a number of women beyond Jean Samet, the iconic Grace Hopper, who I'm sure we legally have to talk about, Gertrude Tierney from IBM, Betty Holberton, who was part of the ENIAC 6, a ton of women who had worked in computing in the Second World War and who were now kind of senior. But I felt compelled to write this particular chapter and to write about Jean Samet and COBOL because I think this is a really interesting moment, transformative moment in computing history. And Jean Samet has kind of been undervalued, actually by me, even when I wrote Broadband, I wrote a chapter about COBOL and I kind of wrote it from the perspective of Grace Hopper, who was also very instrumental in the process of creating COBOL, but more on the administrative side. She kind of convened the committee and it was based on her work. And then she convinced the Department of Defense to implement it and to require the manufacturers made machines that could handle COBOL and that kind of, anyway, she's been given a lot of credit historically as being central to the creation of this really important language, but she didn't actually write it. The less glamorous and more tedious work of actually writing this stuff was done by Jean Samet and several others. And I sort of regretted not being able to dive deeper into that into my book. So when this book came along, there was an opportunity to kind of revisit this slice of history and to give Jean Samet her propers and go on a deeper dive. I was really grateful for that. So thank you, Torie. I was also really interested in revisiting COBOL because of its extraordinary staying power and the implications that has about maintenance and care, which are themes that I'm really always attracted to. I'm sure the audience knows this, but by the year 2000, 80% of code on the planet was written in COBOL, so much so that an entire generation of programmers had to come out of retirement and out of the woodwork to fix, these crucial bugs that would have caused a lot of global upheaval during the turning of the millennium. And even today, it undergirds a lot of our business and finance and administrative systems. 95% of ATM transactions depend on COBOL to run. So I think that's really remarkable and quite rare in the history of code. I mean, we think about tech as an industry these days as being a site of constant upheaval and transformation and reinvention. New technologies come along and we're just expected to abandon everything that came before. We're expected to abandon all these tools that work just fine in favor of something new. So there's something kind of romantic to me about this idea of a long-lasting workhorse of code, surviving the vagaries of time and all the tumult of the last 70 years. And I think it's something to be celebrated and something that I hope we can cultivate more of as we move forward. How can we actually maintain the things that we build rather than just constantly leaping over to the next thing and rendering them obsolete? How does that change the way we think about code, how we build code? And of course, how does that change how we remember and who we remember in terms of the people that are building it? So anyway, I think I've probably gone over my 5-minute intro, but it's broad strokes, my chapter. Joy, your turn.
Joy, yeah.
All right. I just want to echo Claire in saying I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for joining us this evening. And Torie, thank you again for including me in this excellent project. My chapter is called Basic and the Illusion of Coding Empowerment. And I will read the first paragraph and then explain a bit more about that. During the first half of 1964, 2 college-age white men, John McGeechee and Michael Bush, devoted hours to computer programming. So much time, in fact, that McGeechee was known as 225, short for the GE or General Electric 225 mainframe computer for which he was responsible, and Bush was known as 30, short for the GE DataNet 30 computer that he programmed. They were students at Dartmouth, an elite, overwhelmingly white Ivy League college that admitted only men as undergraduates. and they were coding a new computing network. In the early 1960s, McGeechee's and Bush's access to technology was extraordinary. And so I was so excited because I feel like my chapter picks up a bit in some ways where Claire's ends, in that now we're in the early 60s and computing is commercially quite viable. There are many, now thousands of mainframe computers in the United States, but those mainframes are large, they fill up rooms, they're very expensive. So it's only generally businesses and elite universities that have them. And so for these two undergraduates at a small Ivy League college to have such access to computing, this is the extraordinary part. And to me is crucially enmeshed with understanding BASIC. I think BASIC comes into computing the history most often thinking about like Bill Gates founding Microsoft because he wrote a commercial version of BASIC for a hobbyist computer, the Altair, in 1975. What I think a lot of people don't know is that BASIC had existed for a decade at that point, and its origins are at Dartmouth. And are inseparable, as I go on to explain in my chapter, from both Dartmouth's time-sharing network, which I'll explain in a minute, and the fact of Dartmouth as envisioning itself as preparing future elite men leaders of the United States, because at the time, they're only admitting men as undergraduates. So in the early 1960s, if you want to run a computer program on a mainframe, you are basically writing out your program by hand and then turning it over to someone maybe to key punch it into a bunch of punch cards. The story I like to share is that before Dartmouth had their own mainframe computer, one of the math professors there, Tom Kurtz, would take the train from New Hampshire to Cambridge, Massachusetts to use MIT's mainframe computer, and he would carry with him a huge suitcase full of punched cards that belonged to him and his colleagues and were their computer programs. And he would take the train down at 6 a.m. and drop off all of this suitcase full of punched cards at the computer for the mainframe operator to run. And he would go meet with his colleagues and do other professory things, have lunch, walk around, and at the end of the day, pick up the cards and the printout results of the program runs, and then take the train back. And if he needed to fix his program, he had to wait 2 weeks until he made that trip again. So he, Tom Kurtz, and his colleague John Kemeny, who were math professors, together thought there had to be a way to make computing more accessible. And they decided to use an approach to computing known as time sharing that was new in the 1960s. It sounds like what we think of as maybe like a vacation timeshare, where somebody is getting 15 minutes of computing time and then someone else is getting another 15 minutes. But it actually refers to a computer's ability to interrupt its own clock and check for other incoming programs. So Kemeny and Kurtz persuaded the trustees at Dartmouth that they could build their own time-sharing network. And the students did, by and large, most of that programming in machine language. And BASIC was written to become a more user-friendly way to program a computer than something like COBOL, which was absolutely revolutionary, but not the easiest thing to pick up, I think it's fair to say. So the example that I have that I like to share is that there was a student at Williams College who wrote a program in Fortran, which was a similar computer programming language to COBOL. He wanted to write a program to score a ski jump competition, and it took him 50 hours to write that program in Fortran. And a few months later, there was a faculty member at Vermont Academy. This is another, we're in the New England wintry weather. He wanted to write a program that would score an entire ski meet. So not just ski jump, but also downhill, slalom skiing, cross country. I think there's one other. And he did it in BASIC, and it took him 10 hours because the basic commands were more similar to what we would recognize as English in terms of if, then, let, print, etc. So at Dartmouth, time sharing, sort of using the computer network, becomes wildly popular. The students are required to learn BASIC. Within 4 years of the implementation of the network, something like 80% of the students know how to code in BASIC. They're required to take it as part of their first year math sequence. And something like 40 to 50% of the faculty are also using the network in BASIC. And when I first wrote about this in my book, I'm sort of two minds about this. One is there was an intent that this would be very community-oriented programming. It was not commercial. There were a lot of communities that coalesced around BASIC and time sharing, not just at Dartmouth, but around the country. But upon reflection, I realized the fact of these two men, McGeechee and Bush, sitting there writing the time sharing network and running the first, and this is where the sort of lines of code come in, they're the likeliest two candidates for running the first two BASIC programs in May 1964 on this network. It's central to the process of how computing became very masculine and elite and professional, because they are at this very exclusive college. It is all male. And even though Dartmouth sort of shares BASIC freely and opens it up to the world, other high schools and colleges connect, it's at a time when still American education is deeply segregated along not just racial lines, but also gender lines. Girls are not, computing is associated with math. Generally, girls are discouraged from math. And so it seems like BASIC is easy to learn, and it seems like it should be accessible to everyone. But at the moment that it is becoming crucial to the accessibility of personal computing, it is moving in a system that is deeply divided.
Yeah, it's so wonderful how those two stories really do sort of trace this very quick, it feels to me as an observer, shift. And I wonder if you could both talk a little bit, you both sort of hinted at the reasons for that shift, but if you could talk a little bit about why computing was women's work at first, and then kind of like how quickly we saw that change and why. I'd love to hear.
Yeah, I mean, computing was women's work because human computing was women's work originally. I mean, for like close to 200 years, a computer wasn't a thing, it was a job. Same is true for the word calculator. This was a job that women did, working together in these sort of informal or formal networks, cross-referencing each other's work, either by hand or with, adding machines or early analog computers, to do things like, ballistics calculations were a big thing, but also maritime navigation calculations, astronomy, pure mathematics. I mean, essentially the scientific age was made possible by this sort of computational labor, invisible computational labor of all these human computers. So when the time came to automate those tasks, the first people who were hired to man the machines were the women who were already doing this work. So it wasn't really, I don't think it was something that was done with much consideration, frankly. I think human computing was not a highly valued job. It wasn't considered to be intellectual. It wasn't the same as being a mathematician. It was being kind of a numbers worker. I think Charles Babbage called human computing offices thinking factories, and that's kind of the way it was considered. Like, it's just a job that you do with your brain, like hammering a nail is a job you do with your arm. It wasn't sophisticated at all in terms of its public perception. Of course, it was challenging in its own ways. But when these electronic and electromechanical machines were beginning to be created during the Second World War to run these exact same ballistics calculations and such, the people that were doing those jobs already were brought on to just operate them. They were known as operators. The word programmer wasn't used really until much later. They were either known as operators or coders, and their job was considered to be clerical at best, sort of sub-professionals, officially classified as sub-professional. Of course, they were paid pennies. And it was really not considered. Like, the hardware engineers that built these machines were not thinking about use. They weren't creating like a manual. essentially, like, famously when Grace Hopper was given the job of running the Mark I computer at Harvard during the Second World War, she wasn't given any instructions. I mean, she had a PhD in mathematics, she was no slouch, but she had to essentially reverse engineer everything in order to understand how to actually put differential calculus equations onto this mystery room-sized box, not an obvious proposition at all. And of course, in the process of doing that, these refinements became obvious, and the sort of workflow of programming evolved and became more sophisticated. And these women essentially invented programming, although they didn't get any credit for it until much later. And it wasn't really until after the war that computing was seen as something that had an industry with real commercial viability, that the role of person who puts math on computer was considered to be something that had commensurate status. And that was, looking back on it now, it seems like a very quick transition, but it was kind of a generational sea change, I think. I mean, you still had a lot of women working in computing throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, but they were sort of moving slowly from these really senior roles, pushing the art forward, publishing papers, really inventing things, running teams, like the UNIVAC computer, which was the first, commercial computer in the United States. It was synonymous with computing for a decade. The instruction set, the logical design, they were all done by women, all done by these people who had cut their teeth during the war. But, further on in history, we start seeing women doing more, jobs with less opportunity for advancement, key punch operator, data entry, these things that are, have less status. And we see a semantic shift, of course, from coder and operator to programmer, and then finally to software engineer. And that transition, I think, is the most significant. That sort of happened in the late 60s. And this sort of slow professionalization that happened came with an implicit masculinization, because the credentials emerged, and educational requirements emerged too, because it wasn't, in the early days, you became a programmer because you had either been working as a human computer, or you shown an aptitude for puzzles, or you were good at math, or you were a secretary that kind of worked their way up the ranks at a computer company, from data entry to a more senior role. There were ways into the industry that did not involve professional credentials or specific educational requirements. It was only later that, we start seeing, along with the term software engineer, certain expectations, and certain professional associations that were required, and things that might have been more challenging for women to go back to school and get a computer science degree or something when they had families to raise. And so I think that created the conditions, combined with the retirement of that first generation of programmers, the sort of the usual stuff, lack of access to childcare, lack of access to mentorship, wage disparity, sexism. These things all kind of worked in confluence. I think not intentionally, but conveniently. I think like in many industries, and then it created this sort of strange condition that only reinforced itself over the following 20 or 30 years through marketing and like misconceptions. I don't know. I mean, if you look at an ad for a computer in a magazine, like a computer magazine from the 70s or 80s, it's either going to be women in go-go boots lying on top of a mainframe, or something along the lines of like, this new technology is going to finally get rid of all those naggy secretaries in your office, blah, blah, blah. So there was a really like pretty explicit sort of masculinization, socialization that happened. That was, I think, quite, I think marketing was a really big part of it. I don't know. I grew up in the 80s surrounded by images of boys playing computer games and weird science and all this stuff. I mean, it changed quality and dimension, but it was the same message, which I think has an enormous subconscious impact. And these things, it took a generation-ish and change to get to this point, and it will probably take another generation and change to undo, because I know we start our conceptions of who technology is for quite early in life. And I think there's obviously been like heroic effort to kind of course correct with STEM education for young girls, but it's going to take a while to undo, and it's going to be something that's going to be kind of a massive unlearning. And I think coming face to face with the history and seeing that it's not exactly what you would expect, and seeing how incredibly normal and like default the assumption was that women would be at the heart of this, I think that does a great deal in kind of helping us deprogram ourselves, I guess, from the last few decades.
Claire has covered a lot of ground that I would have covered the same. I think there are just like a few more things I want to tease out, which is even when, actually I'll start with sort of a big theme and then come back to it. Like we American culture broadly keeps thinking like these are hidden histories of women in computing, or like, oh, this is such a surprise. And I think weird science is a great example of sort of the stories that were told with the emergence of like the personal computer and tech devices, not just movies like Weird Science, but also books like Hackers, Heroes of the Computer Revolution, or Accidental Empires, like how the boys of Silicon Valley made their billions. Because these were very extremely popular, influential stories, journalistic coverage that were very male focused and were like writing out these literal centuries of human computers, and then the decades when women were central to digital computing as well. But I think an important part of that story is even when women were working as human computers, doing work that was quite complex, they often didn't receive credit for it. Their names weren't put on publications, or it was just assumed that because they were women, this was like, you know, like Claire said, it's like factory work with your brain, but not because the work itself was not challenging, required creativity, et cetera. In the case of the ENIAC computer, which is the digital programmable computer that comes out of calculating ballistics trajectories during World War II, most of the women who were doing those calculations of ballistics trajectories, which could take anywhere up to a week of like intense mathematical computation and calculation, had college degrees. Another example I like to cite is during the Great Depression, there was something called the Math Tables Project, which was this huge works progress administration project to calculate mathematical and scientific tables. And it was led mostly by a woman who had a PhD in mathematics, Gertrude Blanche, who did all of the work that we would now recognize as fundamentally like coding algorithms, breaking down a complex problem into its parts so that all of her coworkers on the projects could complete these calculations. For the majority of her time on the project, for all of her innovation and creativity, almost every paper that was published was credited to her male supervisor, Arnold Lowen. So it's tricky. Like we know there are literally thousands of women who have worked as computers, in computing, with computing, but they don't get credit, or their work is devalued. And I think this is also part of why the sort of professionalization, masculinization story is, in some ways, I find it very frustrating because it's like hey, actually, so this comes back to the like, what makes a good programmer question. When the programmer was all new, no one knew what made a good programmer. People were complaining as late as like the mid 70s, and probably still today, that no one knew exactly what made a good programmer or coder because it's so variable. So all of these proxies were put into place, like so-called aptitude tests, but there's work of my colleagues that show aptitude tests actually were just selecting for masculine traits, or proxies such as a college degree from a place like Dartmouth at a time when a teensy tiny percentage of people had access to a college degree, and they were mostly white men. So this process of credentialing was also a process of creating a hierarchy and deciding what work was, not what work was valuable, but figuring out how to make the work that was valuable masculine work. And I just want to call out here my colleague Mar Hicks, who wrote a great book called Programmed Inequality about how this all happened in the UK, because it's very clear in that case that the government was basically like, we think men should be managers, not women. And so let's find a way to get men into these jobs. It's a great book, and Mar is a super historian. So yeah, Torie, does that get at your
It absolutely does. Yes. And I'm so glad
Okay.
you mentioned Mar, because they're just a brilliant writer and historian on these topics. I mean, one question I have, and it always feels sort of strange to ask this, but I think it's important to talk about it, is why it's important to have a diverse group of programmers besides the sake of diversity. So can you talk for a little bit about, what we lose when we have a lack of diversity in gender, in race, in socioeconomic background in technology?
All right, I'll start with that one. So the strategic answer that I've learned to give just sounds very cynical, but like all the research shows that the more diversity you have in any project, in any setting, the better the outcomes are in terms of what gets built, because there are different approaches to problem solving. There are different understandings of what is the problem. That's one answer. Another answer, though, is that technology is fundamentally like built by people in human systems, and people are like right now by no means is society equal. We still have great disparities in terms of health and wealth and justice, and technological systems often replicate those same structures depending on who is empowered to build them and what they think their great concerns are. So for example, I think Charlton McElwain's chapter in the book gets at this, like predictive policing algorithms now are built on data sets that fundamentally have racist structures because certain neighborhoods that were historically, for example, Black, were over policed, and then as a result categorized as more likely to have crime, and then it creates this vicious cycle where those neighborhoods and communities are over surveilled or surveyed, and that's still happening. It's now happening with AI. And so if you have more diversity of all kinds who can say, this has been my experience, this is something we need to think about. Tech is not just, people often say, oh, I want to do tech for good. Good for whom? Like, this is a key question. I don't think tech is bad by any means, but I think often is missing the question of like, who is going to benefit and who is going to be harmed. And even if you think you're building something that's going to help people, it might harm someone, and you won't know unless you've got someone else in the room who can identify that.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. And I think, we're living with the repercussions today of like what it looks like when tech is designed by a monoculture. We're dealing with all the consequences of that. We see it obviously in problems of harassment and misinformation on social media, problems which are not necessarily anticipated by the people who built those platforms or the people that purchase those platforms, not to subtweet, but and we see it in like, racist machine vision systems and predictive policing algorithms and the way that all these things. And these are things that happen when software products and tools and platforms and services are designed by only one group of people. They're just not anticipating the consequences of the things that they're doing. And they're not like building things for any community of people beyond their own. And it's inevitable that there's going to be mistakes, and it's inevitable there's going to be really dire consequences, sometimes inadvertently, sometimes maliciously, reinforcing a lot of historic biases, denying opportunities to people, putting people in danger. So yeah, the alternative can only be better, right?
Absolutely. One thing that strikes me, Joy, both in reading your chapter and now hearing you talk about it, is that, the people at Dartmouth, the men at Dartmouth, thought that they were increasing access, right? I mean, their goal was to share this knowledge in what they would have considered an egalitarian way, and to bring computing to more people. And I mean, I'm curious from both of you, sort of, where are the blind spots now that you see? And this is a huge question. And when we're talking about increasing access and increasing diversity and representation within tech, are there ways, and of course there's a huge variety of such programs and initiatives, but I wonder if there are any things that you notice that people might be kind of replicating some of these blind spots that we, for instance, saw Dartmouth presenting back in the 60s.
So yes, is the short answer. In terms of, I think, and actually, Torie, I will say, hey, go slate the piece I wrote for you about, like, for 50 years, we've tried to increase diversity in STEM by fixing people, not the system. We're still making those mistakes. So what do I mean by that? It's not enough to say we need more Black women or brown women in STEM, or like we need a gender balance, because it's not just about bodies. It's about how are they credited? How are they compensated? How are they valued for their work? What are their working conditions? Are they facing harassment, et cetera, et cetera? And I think, so another colleague of mine, Janet Abate, wrote an essay where she said, like, how do we, and I'm paraphrasing here, I'm probably going to be a lot blunter than she was, but basically, like, why don't we have courses that are like not just coding for girls, but like, boys, don't be assholes online. And just like sort of fundamental, like, we can't fix the problem just by saying, oh, we're going to make more girls know how to code. We have to fix these structural problems surrounding everything from like childcare and compensation and work culture and tech monoculture and toxic tech. I was rereading, and this is one example of how, like, the more things change, the more they don't. In 1981, the women at MIT who were grad students in computer science and AI wrote a report called Barriers to Equality. And they're systematically documenting all of the harassment, misogyny, et cetera, that they face. And the first time I read it, I thought, like, oh, it's not so bad today. Like, for a second, I had that thought. And then I was like, oh no, let me pull up Emily Chang's book, Brotopia. Or, there are many others I could say that document the same sort of cultures today. So I think we just have to be aware that, like, certainly we can support and encourage diversity in STEM, but it also has to come with a change in societal and corporate and academic, et cetera, structures. Yeah.
Yeah, and I also think we need to just generally reevaluate what we think tech is for and what it can do. Like, I kind of alluded this a little bit in my kind of mini introduction, but there's this, like, brain disease in tech where things are often, new technologies are often presented as blank slates, like, oh, we're on Web 3, we're never going to repeat any of the problems of Web 1 or Web 2, or, now we have virtual reality, so we're just going to sidestep all the problems of the real world and build a new utopia. The same rhetoric we saw in the beginning of the web too, this idea that we could, with this new technology, no longer be beholden to the baggage of race and class and gender and ability, and we could just connect mind to mind in this sort of cyber civilization. It's not possible. I think it's a delusion that we have, that we think that technology can provide any kind of solution to social problems, or find or create, like, a new space that is devoid of all of the baggage that we bring with us in every aspect of our lives. There are no technological solutions to social problems, and we shouldn't expect there to be. I think it's our responsibility to kind of clean up our own house, like, as a society, and not expect tools to fix them for us, or at least not pretend like they can, because I think that also sort of creates a weird obfuscation of responsibility. And I mean, we see that a lot with AI, right? Like, oh, it's neutral, so it's okay that the AI said that this person is a criminal. It has nothing to do with our historic biases or what we want, what outcomes we want as a police department or something. Like, it's a way to kind of obfuscate agency and responsibility. So I think, just generally speaking, like, I don't know how we do this, but kind of like changing the stakes a bit and changing the expectations of what is possible, and, like, really questioning rhetoric that situates any new technology as some kind of, like, do-over or some kind of utopia or some kind of thing that is completely above, beyond, or beside human problems, because human problems are what we are. I mean, it should be the joy of the work is working through that stuff together. And we can only do it if we do it together.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So we're starting to run low on time here. So if you have questions for us, please start putting them into the Q&A function. In the meantime, I do wonder if, as an editor, I often have the terrible responsibility of removing the best bits from people's stories. I was curious, and I probably should have prepped you for this, but it only just occurred to me. Is there anything that we removed from your essay for me, like a really great tidbit that you would like to share about Jean, about Dartmouth, or something else, a little anecdote to kind of illustrate what you were talking about?
There's something that you removed, but there is something I wish I could have included, which is when I was researching the piece, I was trying to find people who knew Jean Samet, and I talked to some of her colleagues from back in the day, but one person pointed me to a childhood friend of hers who was an elderly woman now living in New York, and she would doesn't use the phone. It was or she doesn't use email, and so I had to send her a physical letter to get in touch with her. And by the time I managed to get in touch with her, I was way past the deadline. It had been long gone, and we had submitted it. It was done. So I wasn't able to interview her via snail mail like I would have wanted to, which would have been a really lovely COVID project and just a nice way to connect with an elder. And I regret not being able to do that. But that's just time. That's not you.
Joy, anything from the cutting room floor for you?
Oh, this is a tough question. I feel like, for full disclosure, I went to Dartmouth as an undergrad, and many of my math courses had a computer science component. There was a lot of overlap, but I should say I didn't know any of this history while I was there. And so, I mean, something that and I'm a historian, right? So of course I'm going to say this, but I feel like maybe a first step, and in many sort of coding classes, et cetera, is to have more people and more of this history, and both sort of celebrating the diversity in the past, Margot Lee Shetterly's book Hidden Figures, but sort of that's just the tip of the iceberg and broadband, but also the failures. I mean, as Claire said, technology is not a solution to everything, and neither is it all bad, but it's fundamentally what sort of, I think, we as communities can envision and want to make it. And I'm a firm believer, and maybe if we know a little bit more about what we've done in the past and how it's worked and how it's failed, that can help better inform the future. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'm all for that.
Yes. One question that just came in to me via the chat is, how did you each get interested in STEM?
I'll go. I grew up in a household with computers. My dad worked for Intel. And so I always had computers in the house. I am not a STEMmy person. I don't know how to code. I studied literature and journalism. I'm coming at it from the human side, but I've always been really fascinated with technology. And I've always there's something really profound to me about living in the household that I grew up in. My dad is an engineer. I was not, but we had this shared love of computers. He was interested in what was going on underneath. I was interested in pushing symbols around on the surface, but they were both equally valid ways of interfacing with this technology, because it's a very human technology as much as it is, an engineering as much as it is a piece of gear, it's also something that touches human lives. And I think that's always what's attracted me to the kind of writing that I do is I think technology is this amazing collapsing point where so many different things connect, and there's so much human in it, and it has so much impact on society and on human experience. And that's why I love Joy's work too. I think this emphasis on the user is really key. I dedicated my book to the users. I think in general, we underestimate the value of people who use technology versus people who build it. And I'm really glad to see that being woven into the history, because there's a creativity there that is so profound and so far outside of our understanding of who gets to be part of a canon of tech history. But that's just to say that I've always appreciated the way that it attracts different kinds of people and minds. And so that's how I got interested. But I still look at all of it from the vantage of an outsider. And every time I have to write about real code, I have to do so much brain breaking, idiot's guide inquiry. And I hope that I get it right, although sometimes I have to cross-reference it with my techier friends.
I guess I'm still surprised to think of myself as a STEM person, but this comes from being someone who, so I think I came to STEM from a point of stubbornness, which is that in 8th grade, I had an algebra teacher who will go unnamed. I know her name, I'm not gonna say it, who said at back to school night, parents, if your daughters have been good at math until this point, you can expect that to end because algebra is really difficult and really abstract, and they're just going to struggle from here on in. And I was like, no, this is not happening. I love algebra. I went on to be a math major. It was great for me. I was also a history major. So I really feel like my love of STEM comes from always trying to find ways to connect those two worlds, because I don't think they're as divergent as we make them out to be. Like my senior history thesis was about the history of cryptography, and then my math culminating project was actually writing a code that did encryption, and those were complementary and lovely, and I was very happy. But I always was really troubled by putting up the firm boundaries around STEM versus the humanities or even the arts. So I keep trying to find ways to bring them back together. Yeah, but really, I think I ended up being a math major out of sheer stubbornness. Thank you, 8th grade algebra teacher.
I love that. I will say too that I really got into computer. So my mother coded a bit in the 70s as a consultant. And so in my household, coding and computers were women's stuff. We had AOL Instant Messenger or AOL pretty early on, and Prodigy pretty early on. But I really got interested in computers when I became a fan of the Backstreet Boys in the 90s as a 13-year-old and decided I needed to make a website. So that's how I learned HTML, which is a little embarrassing to admit, but I insist on telling everybody all about it. We have a really great question from Selena Walsh-Smith, which is, what can women working in tech do to make the industry more inclusive for marginalized identities?
I just want to start by saying that I learned HTML because I loved Weezer, so we're in the same boat. I don't know that it's women's responsibility necessarily to do that, right? I mean, it's not the responsibility of the people with the marginalized identities to do that, to carry that labor. It's great if everybody pitches in, but I think it's more of a question of how do we get people, how do we get everybody else to support that vision? And honestly, I don't know. People always ask that question, and I write about history. I don't know. I don't know what we do in the future to fix it. Maybe Joy has a better.
So I'm a big believer in social movements, and I don't want to say unions because they have had their share of problems, but I think there is tremendous unrealized power in collective action in its broadest sense, and in collaboration, and in just sort of whatever you are going through. If you are a marginalized identity in STEM, there are probably 20 other people or 2,000 going through the same thing. And I think there's power there in sort of finding those. But I would agree with Claire that the responsibility, the burden of change isn't, and that those who are historically marginalized and oppressed already carry more than their fair share of weight and burden. On the other hand, I don't think those with power will easily yield it. So there's the question of what this is where I think collective action comes into play. Yeah.
Full Luddite revolution.
I think that we're just running out of time now. So I'll pass this back over to Dana, but Joy and Claire, thank you both so much for this. This was absolutely wonderful. I could keep talking to you both about the history of technology for hours and hours, but you have lives and other things to do. So I will not make you do that this time. But thank you so much for this. And thank you so much to everyone who tuned in tonight. We really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you so much, Torie.
I echo those statements. It was such an interesting talk for me to listen to. Thank you all so much, Torie, Joy, and Claire. I just want to say real quick before, one of the reasons why I like this book so much is I think, especially at the library, a lot of people are used to technology as these bits that are just kind of come along with life, or these bits that you're kind of fighting against in perpetuities or almost working against you and not, functioning the way they want. But I like that the book, with the history and the human qualities that it presents in alignment to technology, gives us a new way to look at it and kind of a new appreciation or sentiments towards it. At least it did for me. So, Torie, thank you so much for putting all of that together, and for Joy and Claire to contribute to it. So once again, thank you so much for joining us. To all of the attendees here, thank you so much. Once again, there is a link available in the chat to purchase your copy of You Are Not Expected to Know This from Labyrinth Books. Additionally, you'll see in the chat the third link there. We're asking for your participation, a brief anonymous survey about the program. If you can participate by following the link at the chat, we'd be grateful for your feedback. Otherwise, you can check out the library's events calendar for more events coming up. So we hope everybody has a great night. Thank you all. Oops.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Enjoy family game night.
Thanks.
It was nice to meet you.
Enjoy. And yeah, it was great to meet you as well, and enjoy happy hour.
Yes, I will. Bye.